I'm Gar Mac Críosta, and I'm the HSE lead on the COVID Tracker app. And it's a very quick journey through the development of it. And I think there's some really interesting lessons that we can learn from how how this was approached and some of the pressures that were on us in terms of how we approach situations like this. We all know what this is now, COVID. So it's become all too familiar. And the color, which I think one of the interesting things for me was at the start, I think we all assumed that yellow was the global color for COVID everywhere. And then subsequently, it was only after I started on this that I discovered it was only in Ireland that it was yellow. In every other country, it's different colors. It was purple, it was green, it was whatever, but it was yellow here. And I think it's an interesting one because it actually goes to the branding and the all of government response, because it became instantly recognizable and everybody understood it and could tie into it and knew this was official. And it was coming from a place that was part of an overall response to it, which again this is just more scene setting with it. So for me, this started on the 18th of March, but officially this started on the 17th of March. So on Paddy's Day, the Guards and DPER came to the HSE along with Department of Health and had a conversation about where technology could play a part in supporting contact tracing, testing, things like that. And at this point, it wasn't an app. And I think this is one of the interesting things, because right now we can't imagine there being anything but an app, because there are apps popping up all over the world. But back then, we didn't know what it was going to be. And it's actually Tim Willoughby's fault. If I hadn't picked up the phone on the 18th of March, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you right now. And I may have had a very different past or months since March. But for anybody who was involved, I think we all came to know there was that bit at the start. And part of the reason for using the graph to go through it is it's to give it context, because back at the very beginning, we could see what was happening. It was like a glimpse into the future. You could see what was happening in China. You could see what was happening in Italy. And you could see the pressure building on the health services. And as this pressure built, it was in line with our development cycle. So you could see the cases increasing, and you can see the pressure mounting on the team in terms of we need to do something, we need to get it out there. And it obviously dipped into June, July, and then back out. And actually in May, we thought we'd missed it. We thought it was all over. It had dipped, it was May, it was all over, and there was no point releasing an app because we were good to go. Little did we know it was going to bounce back as badly as it did again. And obviously this, I haven't updated the top right-hand corner graph there, but that was into October, and we're back down again. But it is one of those things that it was a certain unpredictability and uncertainty to it. And aporia is this sense of puzzled uncertainty, right? So we're at the beginning. We have a general problem as to how can technology fit, but without a clear business problem as to what it was that we wanted to try and do. Now that problem was clarified over really very early on in this process. And what we were trying to do was find we were trying to find people who were too close for too long, where one of them had tested positive for COVID-19. And that was the general problem statement. But the natural course is not to jump straight into an app. Well, I think this is one of the lessons learned, is that a lot of times we commit way too early to single solutions. So we decide preemptively that we're going to actually commit to something. And in this case, we knew that we couldn't commit to anything because we didn't clearly understand what the problem was, nor did we know what the constraints were. So we went on a bit of it was a treasure hunt, trying to find different ways where we could solve for that problem. So we looked at ad identifiers, which is the exhaust fumes of all of the free apps that we use that give off these location trails of us as we go around. And when you see it in action, and I saw some interesting demos from companies in Israel and companies in the US where you can follow somebody nearly in real time around a city to see where they've been and where they go. And then you see some other uses of that where you can see population movements between cities, but done in a privacy preserving way. So ad identifiers, we looked at call data records from telcos. We looked at using QR codes for check-ins. We looked at using location data in various forms, Bluetooth, either hardware devices or something like that. And then using the native capabilities that were on a phone. So in this case, Bluetooth and GPS. So that search was something that went on it didn't just immediately stop. So we'd started building, but we were doing all of this stuff in parallel. So we had this general problem space and we're just working together to try and solve for this. And as we hit problems and as we hit obstacles, and as we began to push it through the lens of a privacy by design lens, we began to see some of the obstacles with this. So from a proportionality perspective, capturing geodata on everybody and who they met for over long periods of time is obviously problematic from a privacy and just civil liberties perspective. So that wouldn't fly. We looked at things like QR codes and the impact of what it would mean if we actually wanted to get people to actually take an action. And getting large-scale populations to take an action and do something is difficult to do, particularly when you're looking at population scale, because so we had consulted with guys in ESRI And Pete Lunn and his team had indicated that this would be a disastrous idea if we were hoping that everybody would just develop a habit over a matter of days to do something like that. But again, it was going through the process of doing all of that. This again, it wasn't a HSE only effort. This was one of those ones where it was clearly a cross-government collaboration all the way from the beginning, and the project team reflected that. And the way problems were solved, the way decisions were made, the way things were done throughout was very much in a collaborative way. So the HSE were the lead in terms of delivery of services for testing and tracing, but Department of Health were actively involved all the way through. So Sarah Gibney, Mersh O'Connor, Niall Sinnott, some of you will know those names. Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. So we had Barry Lowry, the government CIO in OGCIO, and we had Owen Harrison, who was the head of digital. They were actively on the project, along with Angar the Síochána, so Tim Willoughby and Andrew O'Sullivan, plus we had the CSO. We had support from, there was a Government of Ireland thing that was running. So if we needed support from anybody, all we had to do was put our hand up and say, please help us, and people came. And then Defence Forces Ireland were deeply involved in it all the way through as well, both field testing and then just in the overall development of it. And Science Foundation Ireland had research teams that worked with us all the way through. So at one point, I have no idea how many, and it sounds crazy, but I've no idea how many people were actually involved in this, but it's north of 150 in terms of total numbers. But it wasn't like it was a carefully scripted, carefully managed thing. This was a bunch of people who knew what their own jobs were and were coordinating around solving that problem. So it just ran. And it's quite bizarre, but it's for anybody who's been involved in intense micromanagement of projects, this was not that. This was, let all the cats do what they do, and they figured out how to dance together, and it worked. All right. Luckily for me, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But this was my morning, so I reckon we had probably north of 500 Zoom meetings, or well, between Zoom teams. I think we used every telecommunications platform out there, but that was the team that was there, and every morning we met. Most weekends we met as well, and it's epidemiology. There was technology. There was public policy. There was public health policy. There were public health professionals. It was a mixed bag of skills. There were communications professionals in there. So it was a real mixed bag of skills. And it was that interdisciplinary piece of how do we solve these areas? Now, obviously, it's the usual thing of standing on each other's toes. It turns out that everybody thinks they know stuff about technology and everybody thinks they know something about communications. So once we figured out how to dance well together, we were fine. So we weren't alone in this. This was a global endeavor. So as we started, we reckon the NHS were probably 3 weeks ahead of us at the time. There was a team in Singapore who were a couple of months ahead of us, and we reached out to Jason Bay and his team in Singapore, as did 40 other countries, on the 21st of March to say, hey, Jason, you've released an app. Can we have the code? Can you tell us how you did it? And he got that through diplomatic channels, through Interpol, through police, through minister, through prime minister to prime minister. Literally, his inbox was an absolute car crash, I imagine, on that Saturday morning when he woke up, because everybody was reaching out to try and figure out how they'd solve this problem. It became very clear to us at that point that Bluetooth, from a privacy preserving perspective, Bluetooth on devices was going to provide us an optimal solution there. So we began to strongly back something like that and began to build with our development partners. So we had AWS as a cloud partner, Nearform from a software development perspective. We also had XBO for testing, and ISAS who were doing data protection and InfoSec work with us, along with everybody else who was involved in this. But one of the key lessons learned for me was that 3 days in, we had something to show. So we had an end-to-end demo of how this was going to work, what this would look like. And this was more than a wireframe, but it was up and running. And I think seeing is believing. So a lot of us who are, and a lot of the attendees who are participating in this event today, we've all been in that situation where a PowerPoint deck is wonderful. It's pretty, you can see a very slick PowerPoint deck, you get the presentation, it all looks amazing, and then you walk away, but you kind of get the feeling that there's not much there. And my view on this was that we needed to demonstrate that we could deliver something, and the sooner we did that, the better. And that's just really to give confidence to internal stakeholders so they could support and back us, and also externally, for all of the reasons that decisions get made on a cross-governmental basis, we needed to be in a position where we could defend our position, because it's as easy to get killed by friendly fire as by any other fire in a situation like this. So I guess the plan for this as well was that this isn't a standalone thing. It's a fully integrated contact tracing app. So it's integrated into testing and contact tracing, and it's delivered to people out there, to citizens. So this had to work in concert with each other. Other apps that have been delivered globally, they've been delivered in isolation. They've struggled from the point of view of they can't figure out how is it working, is it not working. We were looking at a fully integrated solution. So we were working with the testing and tracing teams and the public health departments to try and get this out there and to figure out how it worked. The app itself, I don't know who's talking there, Ross. It's
No, me neither.
I think I pasted it in. Hang on. I think I pasted in something with a video in it, or with a recording.
It seemed to be relevant to the. It seemed to be about the subject matter, which is very interesting.
Apologies for that. So once I skip over these two, so I think anybody who's involved in this or who's living in Ireland, hopefully everybody who's on this call has the COVID Tracker app and knows what it does. Using information, symptom tracking, and then the core contact tracing piece. I'm going to jump back in here, and hopefully this thing doesn't. We'll have to switch over to the PDF version then, Ross, if it does. Apologies for that. It was right. Fingers crossed this doesn't decide it's going to do something to me. I think one of the key points that happened along it, so we had a series of pivotal moments, and we were happily, so we built the app 3 times in 3 months. The first time as a big data geo-based, we were trying to put people in geo-time boxes to figure out who was with who at what time. That didn't last very long because it had serious privacy problems. The second was based on what Singapore had done with the Trace Together app, which is known as a centralized model, where basically you're capturing traces of people you've been with, and you have the notion of an index patient with contacts, which from a public health perspective it is the way they think about the world. We then we hit a certain problem with iOS. So on Apple, we couldn't get Bluetooth through unreliably in the background, and it became such a problem. And there were teams around the world and research teams from MIT, from Turing in the UK, from all over, trying to solve this problem, and we couldn't solve it. So it came a point where Apple and Google had come to the table and said, we have a solution to this that will work reliably, but the consequence of that was that we had to go to a decentralized model, which meant we lost the index patient. So if you can imagine me turning around after telling Sarah Doyle and her team that, yes, we have an index patient, the following week turn around and go, hey, Sarah, I told you we had an index patient. Well, this time we don't have an index patient. And that conversation began another thing about, is there any real value in this if we don't know who the index patient is? And we had to discover what that was. So I guess along the way, we also hit some challenges. Is that a 2-minute warning or a 5-minute warning, Ross?
That is a 3, but this is so interesting. I'm happy to let you keep going.
That's okay. So I think for anybody who's been involved in large public sector projects, so the critics define the space, right? They define the meme space. We hit the front pages of the Sunday newspapers 4 weeks in a row back in April. And it's not a nice place to be because most of the headlines are not informed, but it's an easy headline to make, and it's clickbaity stuff that just pops out. But everybody from every corner who had some interest in civil liberties and privacy and anything like this, or who had an opinion on where government and what government should do with technology, came out and had an opinion on this. And the first things are the myths. So the myths come out are that government can't deliver. Can't deliver, won't deliver would be my TV show. It's old and slow, and when it's all going in the wrong direction. And you're constantly battling that. And I think that's a belief system internally within the public service as well as externally. So it's something that we have to fight amongst ourselves to try and get rid of that as well. I think the second piece is that this demand for transparency, there is this sense that there's a corrupt cabal who are sitting in dark, smoky rooms, smoking cigars and making plans around it. And that became this thing. So our constant thing, so in the corner, I've got my drama llama. So we were trying to avoid drama the whole way through this. Or that we're privacy destroyers, and this is the beginning of a surveillance society. And then this story about centralized good, decentralized bad that we got bashed with. And it's way more nuanced than that, but it's something that goes on. And I guess one of the things that I'm interested in going forward with this is figuring out how do we create spaces where we can have more nuanced conversations in it, where we can look at trade-offs across things as opposed to polarizing things into this is all about civil liberties or all about privacy, which just ends up being a deconstructed way of looking at it, where this is the integration into people's lives and where it fits. So I guess the one thing to note about all of these and any interactions on the media is the best you can hope for is a no-score draw. You can't really get further than that, and you can't get better than that. You can just hope to get away with not being scarred. So when some of our greatest detractors came out and said, you guys have done a good job, we knew we'd won, but then the ball moved and the game had changed, and then it became a game of efficacy, that this wouldn't work. But when privacy professionals are talking about physics, you kind of know you've put one of those problems behind you and you can move on to the next one. So 110 days in, and that included a new government. So everybody remember back in June, July, when we had the government formation talks? So it was decided that this needed a cabinet decision to go live because it was seen as putting health in everybody's pocket because we were looking at massive scale distribution of it. So we were ready to go. It was in the App Store and Play Store on day 100. And then on the 7th of July, we went live with this. So we went live on the 7th. Within 48 hours, we had 1 million people on board. Right now, we've got 1.31 million. Over 5,000 people have tested positive and uploaded diagnosis keys from their phone. We've notified 10,000 people. 10,000 people have become close contacts as a result of that. And we were averaging about 200,000 check-ins per day on the symptom tracker. So people did actually develop a habit of checking in every day. Now, some of them thought a HSE SWAT team was going to arrive down. If you said you had symptoms, they were going to knock on your door and pull you out of your house and do it. But there was only a small amount. My mother, maybe. We were also the first country to go interoperable with anybody. So ourselves in Northern Ireland were the first two countries to have interoperability set up, and we're now interoperable as of today with 11 countries across Europe. We've had about 8 releases. Yes, we've had 8 releases so far, and the code is now in use so the app in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, Gibraltar, Jersey, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware are all based on the COVID Tracker app, which we contributed into the Linux Foundation. And as of yesterday, and I'm not sure if Paul Reed said it this morning or said it earlier on, so the New Zealand team launched today, and it's based on the COVID Green app. And New Zealand have been held up. So the New Zealand team came out and said, this is a best-in-class contact tracing app. This is the way it should be done. And it's also from a privacy perspective that it totally lined up with what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it. So they've launched their app yesterday, which is based on the code base that we released into the Linux Foundation. And that's been another major revelation, because the communities that have built up globally and how we're collaborating and cooperating on this via the Linux Foundation is a fascinating thing. And it's an interesting model as we look forward as to what can we learn from open source and inner source communities in terms of how we approach solving problems like this, particularly at a global scale. And I think some of the stuff that Martin had talked about earlier on, some of the stuff that George Crooks had talked about, and I forget my colleague from Alone, and we're working with Alone and Age Action on how we integrate with into older communities in Ireland as well, and how we can work with that. So that's Sean. So I think there's really interesting things to be learned from how we collaborated on this and how that worked. I guess to leave you with this, and this is the last slide, so you can relax now, Ross, is that success comes in many forms. And if anybody who's not familiar with Waterford Whispers, I'm guessing most people are, it's a satirical publication, and you're usually skewered on the front of it. So, and government agencies and authorities are usually skewered on the front of it. So once we got this headline, which is man who uses WhatsApp, TikTok, Google Maps, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter apps has privacy concerns about COVID-19 app. Once that came out there and we weren't the subject of the joke, we understood that was about as big a win as we could possibly get from a confidence perspective, because usually you're on the reverse side of that and it's all come out badly. So that is the story of the of the COVID Tracker app so far. Thanks, Ross, and thanks, Martin.
No, thank you, Gar. And very quickly, we just have a quick question for 30 seconds.
Sure.
Somebody's asked, Dave has asked a question, why was the app not accepted for use in the UK? I don't know if you can give us a little insight to that.
It's one of those things that we had open source and it was there. They were actually further along the way. So they had started down a path and were building a centralized app, and then that got scrapped. They launched it and then it was scrapped. And then the team that came in behind, like a lot of the work that we've done, we were kind of collaborating with them, and there were bits that they've done, there are bits that we've done shared across the two, but they built it independently. And it was more like there's a unique piece about, so all the apps do the same thing, but they have to integrate into your public health response. So I think the biggest driver for them was that it didn't fit in to what they were trying to do with the app. And I think the population scale is different as well.
Of course.
So I think there's some different problems there.
Great. Thanks, Gar.
Great, Gar. And keep up the good work. I know you're working now on sort of vaccination, so we'll expect similar results.
No pressure.
No rest for the wicked.
Thanks,